the loyal covenant love, we've been talking about Hesed, this word Hesed. And this loyal covenant love of Yahweh is why, this is where we closed last time, why when Israel is in their deepest days of rottenness, when they're the furthest away from God you can get, a prophet, Jeremiah, here in Lamentations, can still look forward to a day that's brighter than any day he's ever lived. It's just an amazing truth. Israel, Jerusalem had fallen. Jeremiah saw the fall of Jerusalem. He saw the tribe of Judah and Benjamin go out to exile to Babylon. And in the midst of the horridness of seeing the temple destroyed, I mean, imagine Solomon's temple destroyed. In the heart of all that horribleness that was going on in Israel because they had rejected God and God was punishing them. In the middle of all that, Jeremiah says, but I remember this about this God and I'll never forget it. He'll keep His promises. And He's promised Israel that He will restore Israel. He said, this I recall to mind, I remember this, and because of this, I have hope. And what is it that gives him hope? Yahweh's loving kindness. His loyal covenant love. The fact that Yahweh will never, ever, ever break His promise to Israel. So the prophet Jeremiah says, I'm remembering that Yahweh is loving kind and His loving kindness never ends. Good evening, y'all. Come in. His loving kindness never ends. His compassions will never fail. Even Israel being punished, God knows that or Jeremiah knows that God's compassions will never fail. And that they're new every morning. And he says, great is your faithfulness. So in the midst of everything that's going on in Israel, in the midst of their deepest despair, their deepest punishment from God that they deserved, Jeremiah looks forward and says, what a blessed day is coming, because this God, even though we're going through this, will not forget His promises to Israel and will be restored one day. Amazing. I want you to turn with me to Psalm 106. I want to get back into the Psalms tonight. We've looked in other places. We've looked in the book of Ezekiel. We've looked in Lamentations. But I want to get back into the Psalms with this idea of God's mercy, God's loving kindness, God's loyal covenant love, God's promises never ever to be broken. So in Psalm 106 in verse 34, the psalmist, it's a great history. If you want a history lesson, Psalm 106 is a great history lesson, and so is Psalm 107, or maybe it's 105. Two of these Psalms. It's 105, 106. But he's going to use this word nevertheless. I keep telling you, God is a nevertheless God. Even in spite of everything that men can do that's rotten to God, nevertheless, God will remember. God will keep His promises. And we see that in Psalm 106, which is a history lesson of what Israel has gone through. I want to turn your attention to verse 34. Where we've gone through the book of Joshua, and we're starting with the book of Judges. And I said that so I can ask you the question, what period of time is the psalmist going over here in Psalm 106, verse 34 and following? Look what he says. They did not destroy the peoples. When's he talking about? Does that remind you of Judges in the first hour? It's exactly what we're talking about in Judges at the end of Joshua. They did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mingled with the nations. Israel, the Jews, mingled with the nations, and they learned their practices. What practice do you think in particular was horrid to God? Their worship of idols, their worship of false gods. Look what it says. They served, in verse 36, and they served their idols. Israel serving Gentile idols, which became a snare to them, which is exactly all the verses we've been going over in Judges and at the end of Joshua. This is exactly what happened, and that's the period of time he's talking about. Look what it says in verse 37. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. So let me ask you the questions. You're sacrificing sons and daughters. That is idolatrous worship. That is a worship practice. I mean, in the Old Testament, Israel was sacrificing animals to God to cover sins. The pagans were sacrificing children. And Israel, they jumped right in there with them. Astounding how far they went. But what does it say here as an aside? I just want to show you a couple of verses. What does it say? Who does it say is behind all idolatry? Yeah, it says the demons who are led by Satan. It says they even sacrifice their sons and their daughters in these idolatrous worship services. They sacrifice them to the demons. So the Bible tells us very clearly that it's Satan and his demons that are the ones that are coming up with these idolatrous religions and sharing them with men. Men come up with their own idolatries also, but Satan is behind so much of the darkness and evil that's on the earth. I don't have to tell you that. So what we have here is Yahweh demanding to be worshipped by Israel and Satan offering a counterfeit. Happens every day. I mean, think of how many churches are out there that are called churches that do not teach belief alone in Jesus Christ alone for salvation. That's not a legitimate church. I don't care what the sign says out front. That is not a church of Jesus Christ. That is a satanic counterfeit. So you have the truth and you have everything else. It doesn't matter what they call it. Of course, Satan's not going to call the counterfeit church the church of Satan. He's just not going to teach the truth there. And so we have Yahweh who demands to be worshipped in a certain way by Israel, and we have Satan and the demons presenting counterfeits, alternative religious systems. And unfortunately, this mastermind Satan usually gets man to walk away from worshiping Yahweh with more attractive worship services. I want to show you a couple of verses that are in my mind when I say that. Usually, if you look at church history, the way that Satan has lured people away from worshiping the one true God is by offering more attractive worship services. I've told you this in the first hour on Sunday mornings, what it was that was the downfall of Israel. I just want to show it to you here in a couple of verses. Look what it says. What is it that Satan offers? What is the draw to a man, a Jew? What is the draw to walk away from Yahweh and start worshiping some God that doesn't exist? What's the draw? What's that little carrot that Satan dangles in front of them? What is it? Look what the Bible says. In Numbers chapter 31, verse 16, we go back in time quite a way. Moses said to them, "Have you spared all the women?" Because they were supposed to go in Israel. They were supposed to defeat their enemies. And Moses is seeing all these Gentile women and saying, "What's this that you've done? Why didn't you kill the women?" And so he says, "Have you spared all the women? Behold, these women that you have left alive, these women are the ones who caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against Yahweh in the battle of Peor, so the plague was among the congregation of the Lord." Remember what happened at Peor? The Jewish men were going into the Canaanite women. They were having sex with the Canaanite women. They were lured by the women. They were lured by the women. Men are such suckers. We're such suckers. And Satan knows, and he's got our number. Buddy, he's got your number when it comes to dangling a woman. And that's exactly what happened in Numbers chapter 31. If you guys, you young boys especially, need to get into the Proverbs and read the first 8 or 9 chapters of the Proverbs, where God tells you just how much of a trap an ungodly woman is. She'll destroy you. Just like the ungodly women of Canaan destroyed Israel. It was Israeli men's choice. But they often went to the women, and Satan knew it. And every time you see Israel fall, there's a woman that they're following. I could name you women like Jezebel. What was Ahab's wife's name? That was Jezebel. What was Samson's wife's name? These women that are leading Jewish men away from worshiping Yahweh. And that's exactly what Balaam counseled. Look at what it says in Numbers chapter 31, through the counsel of Balaam. Remember this. Look at what it says in Revelation 2 verse 14. God is speaking to the churches. Jesus Christ is evaluating 7 churches in the first 2 chapters, or in Revelation chapters 2 and chapters 3. And look what he says about this Balaam. He says, "But I have a few things against you," speaking to a church, "because you have there some who hold to the teaching of Balaam." What was this teaching of Balaam? In the verse before it says the counsel of Balaam. And in Revelation 2 it says you guys are following in the footsteps of the teaching of Balaam. And thank goodness for Revelation 2, because it says what Balaam did. It says this Balaam kept teaching Balak, who was the king, to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel. And this was the stumbling block: to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit acts of immorality. What was Balaam telling Balak? You want these people, you want their God to run away from them? You want their God to abandon them? Have them do things that are against the teachings of their God. And so Balaam said, have them sacrifice things to idols. Have them worship false gods. Have them sacrifice animals to false gods, and have them commit acts of immorality. Now, can you think of anything that may be the act of immorality that Balaam said, this is how you trap Israel? The word for immorality here in the Greek is pornevo. Need I say more? Look at the Greek word. It's very easy to see pornography in it, porn. Pornevo is the Greek word that says that this is what Balaam was pushing thousands of years ago to be the downfall of Israel. Get them to commit sexual immorality by offering your women to them. Get them to commit sexual immorality by offering your Gentile women to them, and I'm telling you, they'll fall for it. Like Satan doesn't know. I mean, I could get, I'm a youth pastor before, remember? And I could get on a big soapbox about this. Boys, you have to wake up to this truth. It means what does it mean? It means to commit sexual immorality. It means to commit sexual acts that are forbidden, either by custom or by law. So the Mosaic Law clearly says one man, one woman, joined in marriage forever, not 2 wives, not multiple wives, one man, one woman, and in the binds of the marriage contract, enjoy sexual intimacy. But outside the bounds of a marriage contract, don't touch her at all. She's not for you. And that's what Israel did. Because Balaam said, listen, I know you hired me. Remember the story. Balak hired Balaam to curse Israel. And he goes up to these mountain peaks 3 times. And every time he tried to curse Israel, the Lord wouldn't let him curse Israel. He ended up blessing Israel. So he failed at that. So what does Balaam do? Listen, I can't, their God will not allow me to curse them. But I've got an idea. Destroy them from the inside. How do you do that? Dangle your women. Offer your women. They will not be able to say no. And you don't have to be like that, boys, because there's an example in the Bible, and his name is Joseph. And he was a God-fearing, honorable man who a woman dangled herself before Joseph, and Joseph said, "Far be it from me to sin against my God like this." It's an honorable man, a man who understood God, his relationship with God, and said, "I won't touch her. She's not mine." What a guy, Joseph. So that's what's going on here. I know it's an aside, but look at what God says concerning this. We're talking about the rottenness of Israel and the nevertheless of God. Even when they've done everything they could do to offend me, to anger me, God says, nevertheless, as we'll see in just a minute, I'll remember my promises to Israel. An astounding forgiving God. Look what it says in Exodus 34, verse 12 to 16. God says, watch yourself. What does God warn of? What does God know about humanity? And certainly about the men who are supposed to lead their families. What does God know about their men? Look what he says, watch yourself that you make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land into which you are going, or it will become a snare in your midst. Israel was in covenant with Yahweh. They were supposed to maintain that covenant by keeping the Mosaic law and not make any covenant with any other human being on earth. One covenant, the covenant with God. One agreement they were to live by. What are you going to do? Instead of making the covenant with them, this is what I'm demanding and commanding you to do, but rather you are to tear down their altars. Everything that they worship at, crush it. Tear it down, smash their sacred pillars, and cut down their asherim, their poles, their worship poles of the Asherah, the god of fertility. All sexually immoral, all these things. Where they were worshiping, I started this to say Satan offers counterfeit worship services, and the men of Israel fell for it. That's what we're talking about here. But rather, God says you're to tear down their altars, smash their sacred pillars, cut down their asherim, for you shall not worship any other god. This is an aside, a parenthesis. You shall not worship any other god, for Yahweh, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. And then he gets back to the point. Why do you want us to tear down all their altars and idols and all that stuff? Because if you don't, look what he says. Otherwise, if you refuse to do what I'm telling you to do, you might make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they would play the harlot with their gods, because that's how they worship. Their worship was very, very sexual. They had cult prostitutes. Not only, you say prostitute, you think female, right? They not only had female cult prostitutes, they had male cult prostitutes. They were servicing anybody that wanted to come along and worship. And it was all sexual. Because the main god that they were worshiping was Baal, the god of fertility, and his sidekick, Asherah, who was the goddess of fertility. And if you want your cattle to increase, your herds to increase, your flocks to increase, you go to the fertility god and you try to make a deal with the fertility god. That was their mindset. God knew it. You're going to make a covenant with them. They're going to do what they're already doing. They're going to play the harlot with their gods and sacrifice to their gods. And here's the problem. One of them, someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice. What did Balaam say? Get them into your sacrifices. Get them into your happy, enjoyable worship services. Get them to sacrifice with you, and then to eat your food. And this is exactly what God said. Don't do it. The trap is, God told him about the trap long before Balaam set the trap. And you think, how could you be so foolish, man, to walk into that trap? It's because the worship service was fun. Someone might invite you to eat of his sacrifice, and you might take some of his daughters for your sons. Now, why is that? Because God, the omniscient one, knows that sometime in the future, very near, there's a man named Balaam who's going to dangle Gentile women in front of you. He knows it. And so he says, you might take some of their daughters for your sons, and his daughters might play the harlot with their gods. Of course they are. They're going to continue worshiping the false gods the way they always have. And they are going to cause your sons also to play the harlot with their gods. Counterfeit religious systems. And in this day and age, the more enjoyable worship service was all this highly sexually charged pagan worship through the prostitution at their altars, in their temples. It was an orgy is what it was. And they labeled their orgy worship of God. An astoundingly disturbing way that they thought they were worshiping their God. But that's what you have in the Bible. So, back to Psalm 106, keep reading with me. It says, they did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded. They mingled with the nations and learned their practices. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. We're talking about Israel. They even sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons and shed innocent blood. What do you call shedding of innocent blood? What's the word? Murder. Thou shalt not murder. One of the 10 Commandments. What does Israel do? Shedding innocent blood. I mean, once you start down this road to sin, it's hard to stop it. They shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters. They were murdering their daughters. They were thinking they're sacrificing their daughter to a God who can actually do something for them. God who knows everything says, no, I'm the God who not only has done things for you and am doing things for you, but will continue doing things for you. But yet you have brought up this imaginary God that Satan and the demons served up to you, and somehow you believe that that piece of wood, the representative of that God, can help you. So much so that you're willing to sacrifice, to murder your own children at the altar of this God. We're trying to get to the nevertheless God. You shed innocent blood, the blood of their sons and their daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with the blood. It wasn't cleansed. God wanted them to go in and cleanse the land of all the Canaanite, all the idolatry, the altars, the Asherah, the pillars. Clean the land off. I want it purified so that Israel can worship me, who will be there in presence. But they didn't do it. Jesus will do it one day when he comes back at the Battle of Armageddon and cleanses the world, cleanses the land of Canaan, cleanses Jerusalem. It will happen one day, but it didn't happen then. Verse 39 says, thus they became unclean in their practices and played the harlot in their deeds. They prostituted themselves. That's what that means. We were in Ezekiel 16 last time we were together, and we talked about that idea. They were married to God. God took them as his own bride. And what did his bride do but turn an unfaithful heart to her husband, and she went out and offered herself to false gods. And God considers that and speaks of that as prostituting herself. She was a whore. She was a harlot wife is what God called her, Israel. And he would punish her. Look what it says in verse 40. God doesn't say, that's okay. I just want humans to be happy. I want you to choose your own truth. Do whatever makes you happy. That's fine with me. That's not at all what God says. He has a standard to live by. And when Israel did this, it says in Psalm 106:40, therefore, because of all these things that Israel did, the anger of Yahweh was kindled against his people Israel, and he hated his inheritance. Strong language. And so he punishes them in verse 41. Look at verse 41. Then God gave them into the hand of the nations, and those who hated them ruled over them. I told you, because the Bible has told us that at the birth of Israel, the nations hated her. There's never been a heyday for Israeli Jewish popularity on the earth. They've always been hated. And here it says God turned Israel over to the hand of nations that hated them, and those nations ruled over them. Their enemies also oppressed them, and they were subdued under their power. Many times he would deliver them. What book are we talking about here? What period of time are we looking back at? Many times, not once, but many times, God, Yahweh, would deliver them. They, however, were rebellious in their counsel, and so sank down in their iniquity. What book would you read about that? Where is this that he turned them over to the hands of the nations, they were oppressed, and then God would deliver them, maybe send a judge? It's where we're at. It's the book of Judges. It's the book of Judges. It's exactly what we're going through. And every time a judge would die, Israel would not only go back to idolatry, but according to the Word of God, they would get deeper into idolatry. Unbelievable. Verse 44, though. Who's this God? Everything's negative. Everything's negative so far because of Israel, the people, the choices that God's nation made in rejecting Him, walking away from Him, selecting false gods to worship instead of Him that they thought could do something for them. But what's God's response to all of it after the punishment? Nevertheless, Yahweh looked upon their distress when He heard their cry, and He remembered His covenant for their sake. Because when He makes a promise, like the promises He made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and to Moses and to Joshua and to all of Israel, He never goes back on a promise. So what does it say about God? What do we learn about God in the Psalms? God says, I'm a God who looks down on the distress of humanity and remembers my covenant with them. He remembered His covenant for their sake, and He relented according to the greatness of His loving kindness. Now we're going to see when we go through the book of Judges, we're in the middle of it now, at least we're starting it, we're going to see that when God comes back and brings a deliverer to Israel, what we're going to find out is that when God does that, until we get, I think, to Judges chapter 10, it's just based on His compassion. The people are in distress. They're being afflicted because they're idolaters. And what we don't see in the book of Judges is they call out to God and say, if you'll save us, we will turn away from the idols and we will worship you again. You don't read that. What you read is what you see right here. He remembered His covenant. He remembered His character in making a promise to Israel, and He relented not because of who Israel was. It says in the Psalms, He relented according to the greatness of His loving kindness. Chesed is the word there. Chesed, C-H-E-S-E-D, for loving kindness. You might find it written as, what's the other word in the Bible that it translates? Mercy? Is it mercy? Anybody have His great mercy? But loving kindness, New King James, New American Standard translate this loving kindness. And it's this Hebrew word chesed. And what does it mean that God remembers in the greatness of His loving kindnesses, He remembers Israel and doesn't destroy them entirely. He punishes them, but He never destroys them entirely. Israel always has the love of God. And this chesed that God uses here is Yahweh's loyal, faithful, covenant love. It's His promise-making love. Covenant, the promise, the contract, the agreement. This is this wonderful Hebrew word that God remembers and acts upon even when humans, Israel here in context, are as rotten gets. It doesn't change the loving character of God, the forgiving character of God. Loving kindness. He remembered His covenant for their sake and relented according to the greatness of His loving kindness. What we're going to find in the book of Judges is that Israel will be punished by a Gentile nation. God will bring on them a Canaanite nation, and they're just in a really, really bad way and cry out to the Lord because they just can't take it anymore. And God says, okay, I love you. I'll send a deliverer to lift you up. Only when we get to Judges chapter 10 is it prefaced with, they called on the name of the Lord and they basically confessed their national sin to Him. But the first 5 or 6 times He brings a judge, you don't read that at all. It's God seeing His people afflicted and saying, because of my loving kindness, I'm going to lift the punishment for now. I'm going to give them another chance. Isn't it? He's just an astounding God. A couple more verses and we're going to close. Psalm 78, another great history lesson in the Psalms. Psalm 78. You want to read a history lesson of Israel? Psalm 78, Psalm 106. Where is it in Acts? Is it Acts chapter 7 where Stephen, or is it Acts chapter 3 where Stephen gives that wonderful lesson? It's in Acts chapter 7. Another one chapter Israeli lesson that goes from the birth of Israel to the end. Psalm 78 is one of those. What does it say in verse 36? Look what I've got it up here on the board. But they deceived him with their mouth. Who's the they? It's Israel. They deceived him because they said, we will worship only you, but they didn't. So they deceived him with their mouth. They lied to him with their tongue, for their heart. See, they were giving him lip service. See, he was hearing, oh, everything that you say we will do, but in their heart wasn't involved in that decision. Their minds, their thoughts were not involved in that decision. It was just putting him off, Maybe we can con him into thinking we'll really do this. But God knew their heart. And the Bible says, for their heart was not steadfast toward Him, nor were they faithful to His covenant. In the very next verse it says this, but. So what are we introduced about man? And let me tell you, don't get your mind on Israel and say, what a bunch of rotten scoundrels. They must be the worst people on earth. I'm telling you, there are days that to whom much is given, much is expected. And when the Christian sins, it's just as abhorrent to God as what He's saying about Israel here. This isn't a Jewish problem. This is a human problem. So I'm showing you Jewish history because this is what we have recorded in the Bible. But when God gets around to saying but, and shows His compassion and His forgiveness, you and all of us should fall down on our knees in humility and thank God for forgiving us and forgiving us our sins and not destroying us and treating us with compassion and mercy. This isn't I'm not doing this to beat on Israel. And the Bible doesn't do this to beat on Israel. It just tells the story of the human heart using the Jews to do it. Every one of us is capable of God wanting to consume us, and every one of us probably has done things, well, I guarantee you every one of us has done things that God could have destroyed us for. Being born a human in Adam's race is what I'm thinking of. Because when you were born human, sinful, that was enough for God to destroy you in the lake of fire forever. But He didn't. He showed compassion. He sent Jesus. He gives us all a chance. Believe and be saved. In Psalm 78, verse 38, it says, but He, God, even though Israel does all their rottenness, but He, being compassionate, forgave them. Forgave their iniquity. He forgave them of their sins. For killing their sons and their daughters and offering them to demons. God forgave that? Yeah, that's what He did. Because that's who He is. Because that's who He is. He forgave their sins. He did not destroy them. He often, Not once, not twice. Look at this God. He often restrained his anger and did not arouse all of his wrath, because Israel was constantly challenging God. So often he had to restrain his anger and not arouse all of his wrath. Thus he remembered Zakar, a covenant word. He remembered the promise. He remembered the covenant. And he remembered the covenant people that he made the covenant with were just people. They were flesh. And a wind that passes and does not return. The brevity of life, the shortness of life. So God has such great compassion for humanity. And it's on display in the Bible with the nation of Israel. After everything Israel does to God, what does it say? Being compassionate, he forgave her. And you think, how could you forgive that harlot wife? After everything you've told us in the Old Testament about this particular bride, Israel, how could you forgive her? And he says, what you should be asking is, how could I forgive you? Because if I can forgive Israel, I can forgive you. You seem to be putting yourself above Israel in not deserving what Israel deserves. And here we have God saying, humans, all of you deserve to go to the lake of fire for all eternity. It's because of my great compassion and my mercy that I offered a solution. So it's not just about Israel. Often he restrained his anger. And we're going to close in this verse. Look what it says in Malachi 3:6. You know, this is one of my favorite verses. This is one I hang a lot of weight on. Because if God could change, it would not be worth preaching this God. If he could change, if he could change one thing out of 200 trillion, he would not be a God worth worshiping. Because how do you know that the thing that's going to change is, I don't want to maintain your salvation anymore. I'm going to send you to the lake of fire. If he could change, he wouldn't be a God worth worshiping. And I love this passage, but look what he says about himself. He says, for I, Yahweh, do not change. And I love this next phrase because he says, and you should thank me for it. Not only Israel, but every one of us should thank God that he doesn't change, because what he says about not changing is, it's because I will never change that you, sons of Jacob, are not consumed. Because if I could change, maybe I would destroy you, because you certainly have deserved it. But because I don't change, and I made an eternal promise from the love that I am to the Jew, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not only are you not consumed now, you never will be. You'll always be. There will always be Israel. No matter how hard Satan tries to destroy Israel, Israel will always exist, eternally exist. And one day they'll have Jesus Christ as their king. So he says, you're not consumed because I keep my promises and I don't change. And then he says this about Israel. From the days of your fathers, you've turned aside. From the very beginning, you've been an idolatrous people, wanting not to worship only me, but wanting to worship anything you could worship. From the days of your fathers, you've turned aside from my statutes, and you've not kept them. And God gives an offer to Israel that he gives to everyone, return to me, and I'll return to you. In the New Testament, it says, draw near to God, and he'll draw near to you. Approach God. You want a relationship with God? You serve a God that is open-armed all the time. The only reason you don't fall into his arms is because you don't draw near to him. It's not his fault. He exists to have an intimate relationship with each of us. Return to me and I'll return to you, thus says Yahweh of hosts. But what's the response from Israel? We don't know how. We don't have the heart to do it. Our heart is idolatrous. Our heart is rejecting. The heart that turns aside from your statutes and doesn't want to keep them is still the same heart we still have. How shall we return? How shall we return? O Israel, hope in Yahweh. For with Yahweh there is loving kindness, chesed, loyal covenant love, eternal loyal covenant love. And with Him is abundant redemption, and He will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. Sometimes God speaks of Israel as a son. Out of Egypt I called my son. And sometimes God speaks of Israel as a woman, his wife. So, just so you don't look at that and think, what does that mean? Next week we're going to be in a very interesting passage, or Sunday. And I want you to read ahead a little bit and get familiar with the story from Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34, we're going to spend the time in Exodus 34:6 and see just exactly what it is that God wants us to know about Him. If God had a business card, if this was all He had, a business card, very small amount of space to inform humanity of who He was, what would God write on His business card? You hear what I'm saying? Rick King, pastor, Gulf Coast Bible Church. What would God write on His business card if this was all He had? And in Exodus 34 verse 6, He tells us. What's the most important thing about me? What do I want to be remembered as always and forever? These things right here. And I think you'll be interested in the list that God chooses for Himself. We'll talk about it next week. Sunday. Father,